everybody, welcome to day 5 of Vlogmas. Today we are going to get into pattern tracing, and there are 2 reasons to trace your patterns. If you are using an envelope pattern, you do not have to trace. In fact, some people don't. There are 2 camps. There are people who trace patterns and there are people who just cut them, and that is fine when you're using an envelope pattern where the pattern pieces do not overlap. Sizes do overlap, but the pieces themselves don't overlap. So you can cut your size if that's what you want and move on with your life. Now, I like to trace those because I don't know if I want to make the thing again. I don't know if I want to make a different size. And if I cut the pattern, that's it. It's cut, and that is all that you get. If you trace it, well, it's a little bit more work. You get the option of using the pattern again and again. Now, when it comes to magazine patterns, you have no choice but to trace, because if you have ever seen the inside of them, they are like a maze of lines and pieces, and everything overlaps, sizes overlap, pattern pieces overlap, and you cannot cut them. If you cut them, you probably end up cutting a pattern piece that you need, and now you don't have that either. So for magazines, you absolutely have to trace, and there are many ways that people do that. I like to use tracing paper. This is called tracing paper, and it is sold at art supply stores like Dick Blick's. That name always makes me laugh. Utrecht art supply stores, and pretty much anywhere else where you can buy drafting paper or artist paper, the drawing paper for painters and artsy people. It's very translucent, and it's actually pretty good when it comes to durability. So let me show you how to do that. The first thing you have to do is locate your pattern pieces in the pattern sheets of the magazine, and once you do, you have to separate the pattern sheets from the magazine. They're usually stapled. Once you have located your pattern piece, and I'm gonna do a small one here just to show you, what you do is you put the tracing paper over the sheet and start tracing. Now, before you start tracing, you do need to make sure that you know exactly what size you're tracing, because a lot of times, depending on the density of the pattern sheet, they will just blend together, and it'll be more difficult to see through the paper than if you were just looking straight at the pattern sheet. So make sure that you start at the pattern sheet, make sure that you follow visually all the lines of the pattern piece that you want to trace before you put the paper on top. So paper on top, and let's start tracing. And you want to make sure that when you are tracing, that you are staying as true to the original lines as possible. That way your pattern piece is not all wonky later. Make sure that you transfer all notches, all of the grain lines, and anything else that you're going to need to later put your garment together. And remember, if you're using a pattern magazine, they will more than likely not have seam allowances included. There are some very, very rare instances that they do, but by and large, if you're using Burda, Fiber Mood, Les Maisons Victor, Modelina, Patrones, or La Mia Boutique or anything like that, they don't have seam allowances. So what you just traced is your actual seam line, so that is where you're going to stitch. So once you have done that, you can move your pattern sheet aside, and now comes time to add the seam allowances. And this is the part where it is entirely up to you. For big 4 patterns, and I think most indie patterns, the seam allowance is 5/8. That is actually quite wasteful, and if you are adding your own seam allowances, you can choose whatever you want. For me, for wovens, I prefer to have a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and for knits, a 1/4 inch seam allowance. To add the seam allowances, there are a variety of ways you can do this, just like there is to add, or just like there is to trace the pattern itself. I've tried many ways, and the way that I'm about to show you is my favorite. I have this little ruler that is marked with 1/2 inch increments, and then also an 1/8 of an inch increment on the main part of the ruler, and then on the very edges you also have 1/16 of an inch, which makes it very easy to use to add seam allowances. So let's start by adding the seam allowance to our straight edge, and this is the easiest. You just line up your edge, so your marked pattern piece side with the seam allowance amount that you want. Here is 1/2 an inch, and then just trace that, and you will want to extend it at the end. You want to do this for all the straight edges, so down here as well. And then very carefully just go around, sort of rotating your ruler, making sure that the 1/2 inch point is always right up against your stitching line. And you're gonna do this all around until you have a piece that has all of the seam allowances done. That's it. Now you have your pattern piece, you have added your seam allowances, and the only thing you have left to do is transfer the notches from the seam line to the edge of the seam allowance here. And then of course you cut it, and that's what you do for every single piece of your pattern. If you are using the envelopes, then you don't need to add that step because these already have seam allowances. One thing to keep in mind is that so in this case it's pretty simple. There are no sharp points that come together at an acute angle or anything of the sort, but if you have some of that, there are best practices for those sort of things so that you don't end up with a seam that is, you know, very angled and very pointy. But that is like a story for another day. But for the most part, this is all that you need to do. This is basically what I have been doing for the last 10 years when I've been sewing with pattern magazines, and I hope that this is helpful for you. I know a lot of these pattern magazines are shrouded in mystery in the US because we don't have a long history of using them like people in Europe do, but it's really not that complicated. Once you can get around the thought of having to work with this, which can be a little bit intimidating, and this one not so much, but if you look at the Berta ones, they are almost undecipherable at times. Once you get over that, it's really not that difficult. It is a little bit more involved, but not really something that should keep you away from trying these magazines, especially because the fit is a lot different than the ones in envelopes and indies, and you may find that you like them better than you like envelope patterns. A lot of people sew with Berta style only because they love how they fit, and the fit is very consistent. There's no insane amount of ease like with the big four. So that's one reason to use these patterns. And I hope my tips for today have helped you sort of conquer your fear of tracing patterns and adding seam allowances. And that is what I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye.